Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Collective Clicks podcast. This is your host, Brandon Bateman, and today I have something a little bit different for you. Usually I'll be bringing a guest on this podcast, but today I'm doing something solo, and I'll explain to you why I'm doing this. We did our event as a company for our clients last week. So what happened is we had real estate investors from all over the country fly in. We did this event at a ski resort. We did a little bit of skiing and we did a little bit of masterminding, which really comes down to people that showing what's happening in their business, giving advice, giving ideas, and then also receiving advice, receiving ideas about what they could be doing better. So one person goes to the front of the room and they give their presentation. And as they're giving the presentation, it comes out that the reason they are there and the other people who are supposed to be there with their company were not there is because they had their entire dispo department quit last week. So then we started talking about like, why would that be? What happened? What were the events that led to this happening? And there was a lot that was going on in their specific situation, probably even a lot that I don't know about or that we didn't get to. But what this made me think is, what advice does this person actually need? And a little bit of background on me, I feel like I've been through a heck of a journey on leadership. And this podcast is not at all me saying that I'm a great leader at this point, because I still think I have a lot to improve on. But if there was a most improved category, I think I might fall in that category. I'm not the MVP, but I might win that little most improved trophy, mostly because of how absolutely horrible I was years ago, even when I started recording this podcast about 2.5 years ago. My team found me intimidating. They found themselves trying to not be caught doing bad things. And I found myself put frequently in what I thought was a situation where I just couldn't be a good leader because the circumstances inhibited me from being a good leader. And throughout this entire time period, I received a lot of advice, and some of that advice was helpful, some of it was not. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about today is, what actually do I feel ended up helping to make the difference for me, and what advice was not actually helpful. And one thing I'll be clear about is all of this advice that I'm going to share is true. And it is, what's the best word for this? None of it's misleading, none of it's wrong. But the reality is some of it worked, and some of it, even though it was good advice, it wasn't good advice for me, and it didn't end up being helpful. So let me tell you first the 3 pieces of advice that were not helpful, and then I'll tell you the 3 that I received that actually were helpful and were needed and did make a big difference eventually for me. So the first thing, and this is what I heard constantly, you need to improve your culture. And I'll be vulnerable on this for a second. We went through definitely some periods of having a bad culture at Bateman Collective. When there were like less than 12 people in the company, the culture was actually really good. And we measured this using a tool that you may have heard of, or you may even use in your own company for measuring employee satisfaction, called Employee Net Promoter Score. The way it works is you ask all your employees, how likely are you to recommend working at this company to someone else? And they will respond on a scale of 1 to 10. If they are anywhere 9 or 10, we call those promoters. These are people who are really happy. Anybody that's a 7 or an 8 is called, I forgot exactly what you call it, but they're basically neutral, right? And they don't contribute to this score. And then anything between 0 and 6, those are what we call detractors. And what you do is you take your promoters, the number of promoters, and you subtract your number of detractors, and you ignore those people who are in the middle. And that tells you your end net promoter score. And it gives you a score anywhere from negative 100 to positive 100. And we got as low as like negative 45. To give you some context, really 0 is considered like good, and then above 20 is considered really good. So we started out at 40, and then we went down slowly all the way to like negative 40, and then we climbed back up to positive 40 again. And if you look at what happened there, it was good when the company was smaller. And then as it grew and grew, then the culture didn't grow with the company, and it became really negative, and then it needed to get more positive. And what I found is some of that feedback that we got through those surveys, where we asked people like, why are you saying this is, why are you rating the company low? It was helpful, but not helpful, because it was really addressing like the symptoms. So all the different things that we could supposedly do to improve our culture, it's not doing any of those specific things that I found other people, like other leaders that were talking to me about how do you improve your culture, say you need core values and you need this vision, you need this like meeting cadence and all these things. So I tried all those things and none of it actually made a difference like at that point. And I'm not saying this is bad advice. I'm just saying it didn't make a difference. And I'll explain to you why it didn't make a difference. The other piece of advice I got that I thought was really hard to follow was give more positive feedback. Because what I was doing was 90% of the feedback that I was giving to people was negative feedback. And maybe 10% of it was positive. And people pointed out good leaders, they tend to give a lot more positive feedback than negative feedback. But the reason this wasn't super helpful to me is because I was only seeing negative things. So for me to give mostly positive feedback would require me to be inauthentic what I was actually seeing, what I was actually feeling, and it became really difficult. And I thought, if I have to give these 10 points negative feedback, because these absolutely need to be said, then that means I need to find another 90 things of positive feedback. It seemed like this insurmountable goal. And I tried to give more positive feedback, and I found myself failing at giving the amount of positive feedback. And then the last piece of advice is I learned that leadership is like sales, and it's selling people on what you need them to do. And what this came back to is this for me was just not super authentic. And I'll explain why none of these things worked. Here's the problem. These are all tactics, right? These are things to do, things to change. But in my opinion, what was wrong with this advice is it only addresses the symptoms. Probably my favorite comparison I've heard from this is picture it like your character is a tree and your reputation is the shadow of that tree. Does the tree affect what the shadow looks like? Absolutely. The shadow, it only exists because of the tree, right? And if you want to change your shadow, what can you do? You can change your tree. But does the shadow always reflect exactly what the tree looks like? Not exactly. It's just going to mirror a little bit what it looks like. I really like there's a book called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey. There's a few things that he says in there. Really at the beginning of the book, what he talks about is what he thinks is wrong with most personal development books. And this is written, I don't know, probably 30 years ago or more. And what he talks about is a lot of them focus on he calls the personality ethic. It's like, how do we adjust our personalities as leaders? How do we adjust our personalities as people? And what he talks about is how it's so important for us to focus on instead the character ethic, right? So we don't want to focus on like how do we adjust the shadow. We want to focus on how do we adjust the tree, because the character trumps the personality. And another quote of what he says is, "What's in your heart oozes out." And as I tried to follow these three pieces of advice, what was wrong was what was in my heart. And the only way I could change how people felt about working with me and how they felt about working with this company was changing what's in my heart to be more the person that they would actually want to follow. So and I know that's super vague, so I'm going to try to make this more specific. Here's the three pieces of feedback that I think I needed and that I did hear amongst all the feedback I was getting. The first one, every good leader is a student of leadership. I found it incredibly important to just read everything I could possibly read about leadership. And there's a few different books that I think were really impactful to me. And really what it comes down to is anything you do to improve yourself improves your leadership, right? What is leadership except being somebody worth following, right? So some of this is more personal development focused and some of this is more leadership focused. But there are three books that made a difference for me. The first one I've already mentioned a couple of times, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, which is in my opinion one of the best books I've ever read. Potentially I'd put it number one in terms of books I've read. Another one that's great is called The Gap in the Gain. This book is one of the ones where I found it most helpful in transforming the way that I saw the world and starting to see the positives and less of the negatives. And I guess what I really learned from The Gap of the Gain, and I don't even know if it directly says this in the book, I used to look at it like I have to be accurate. I have to have an accurate perception of the world. And what I realized is the word accurate is something that the negative mind can say to encourage you to see negativity. And sometimes the only difference between something positive and something negative is just your perspective on that thing. And then the last book, Leadership and Self-Deception, also a fantastic book. It's one that we're actually reading right now as a company, and I couldn't say enough good things about it. So that's number one. Every good leader is a student of leadership. And the only way I really changed was I set aside time every single day to read about personal development and read about leadership and try to apply those things into my life for literally years. And I found that it didn't make an immediate impact. It eventually did make an impact. This next one is another thing that's right along the same lines. Daily gratitude. This is actually something that I got from the book, The Gap in the Gain. And what it talks about is how you should write down on a day-to-day basis. You should write down things that you're grateful for. And what I specifically tried to do is every day write down things I'm grateful for in my life, and then also team members I'm grateful for. And this is really powerful in the sense that it changes what you're looking for. Because here's what I realized. Like there are potentially an infinite number of things that you could give your attention to. And some of those things are positive, some of those things are negative. And I used to consider myself a realistic person because I would see a lot of those negative things. And I would also see some positive things, but I would see a lot of negative things. And what I learned is it really just depends what direction you're looking, because there are enough positive things in your life probably that you could completely cover your entire view with them. There are also enough negative things that you could completely cover your entire view with them, right? But by focusing on daily gratitude and taking out some of those positive things and making it so you're actually like practicing this effort of finding those, it gives you a different attitude going into the day, and it starts to train your mind to look for those things. And over time, in my case, I started to see that there's a lot more positive in my life than I thought there was in my life. And that changed who I am, that changed my character, and by extension, changed how I lead. And then this last piece of advice, spend time around leaders who inspire you. If you don't have a fantastic example in your life, I do think this is really hard to do. And that's where I was for a period of time. The big thing that changed this for me, honestly, was that I hired somebody within my company. And this is somebody who I hired to lead a department. And while they were great at that, a great quality that they had is that they happened to be an incredible leader. And that was one of their main skills. And this person actually was so good at leadership, and honestly not that good at some other things, but because they were so good at leadership, they got great results. And I got to observe that and see how that was happening. And I became a student of this person, and I started to be able to recognize those traits in other people, and even attract other leaders based on that same ability. So this is one that was huge for me. You have to see it in action. So what does this do? This changes the character underneath, right? And I'm only speaking to why I was a bad leader. The reason I was a bad leader was I saw negative constantly. I felt like my company was like spiraling to death the next day, almost every day, almost for certain. I felt like the people who worked for me and were incompetent. And a lot of these things just came down to perspective. So why does changing the character make a difference? Because if you feel like you're a student of leadership, then people will see you as humble. And if you're grateful, then people will sense that gratitude. And if you are grateful, you'll see the good, and then you'll come to communicate the good, and then you'll be able to see the good in a person. Because the reality is someone cannot outperform their own, what's the word? Someone cannot outperform their own perception of their own capabilities. Right. So what I was doing is I was taking people that were unsure of their own abilities, and then I was trying to tell them why they're bad. And in doing that, what I did is I actually lower their perspective of their own abilities, which lowered their ceiling for performance. Whereas what I should have been doing is actually communicating to them that they are better, right? Because the way I saw it is that I have these incompetent people, and that's why I'm a bad leader. And honestly, I probably wouldn't have said that, right? If you asked me what's the problem, I'd say it's probably me. But what did I feel in my heart at times, especially when I was frustrated? I felt that the people were the problem. Another quote from Seven Habits of Highly Effective People, Stephen Covey says, the way you see the problem is the problem. And what I learned is that advice that I got, that leadership is sales, it was true, but it's not selling people on doing the things that you want them to do. It's selling them on their own potential that you can see in them that they just don't see yet. Probably to say that even better, goodness, this is going to sound like a commercial for the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, but another Stephen Covey quote here. He says, my definition of leadership is communicating to people their worth and potential so clearly that they are inspired to see it in themselves. I want to give one other story of this, and then a couple examples of how this is different. John Wooden, as you likely know, is known for being one of the greatest basketball coaches. And in an interview, somebody asked him what the secret to his team's success was. And what he said was the secret to success is getting everybody to try their best. So then somebody asks him, he said, getting everybody to try their best, isn't that what you tell students who are failing that aren't that good, right? Isn't this like participation trophy stuff? And what he explained is no, that's not their best, because the reality is people are usually capable of so much more than they see that they are capable of. And the role of the leader is to help them see that and inspire them to rise to that level that they have not yet risen to. And sometimes that takes the form, and I'm paraphrasing all of this because this is all just off memory, but what he essentially says is sometimes that takes the form, look at you, you're so great. You did this great thing. And sometimes that takes the form of, I know you can do better. But in both circumstances, that comes from a place of the leader believing that the person is capable of more than what they're already doing. And I'll give a couple examples of this. I had a leader recently in my company whose department was not doing very well at all. And I had a conversation with him. And I think what was really important about this conversation is I went into it and I had to remind myself, I had to think, what is my job? What do I have to do to be a good leader? And what I thought to myself and what I wrote down is what I have to do to be a good leader in this circumstance is I have to feel love for this person. I have to remind myself that I love this person. And I have to remind myself what I think this person is capable of. Because the reality is, if I think this person is not capable of more than what's happening right now, then I should just let them go. If what we're getting right now isn't the results that we need to get, and I feel like they can't do better, then I should let them go. But I'm not letting them go. And the reason I'm not letting them go is because I do think they are better. I do think they can produce more. I just think they're currently not doing as good of a job as they could do. So I had this conversation with this person, and I'm pointing out all these places that I feel like they could be doing better. And let's call his name. John looks at me and he says, basically, I feel uneasy about this and I feel like I'm failing in my job. And I looked him in the eyes and I said, John, this is exactly what it looks like to fail at this job. And I know that you can do better. I know you have it in you to get these things organized. I just think we need to make a few tweaks and we can get the performance of this department where we need to get it. And then after a few weeks, we got the performance where we needed to get it, right? And this person rise to this occasion. Another example of this, of like things I've done recently that I never would have been able to do prior to that. I had someone in my company responsible for figuring something out. I won't go to all the details, but the brief summary is I asked them like, where are we at? They told me where we're at. And then I noticed something seems a little bit off here. What's really going on? Why is this like this, not like that? And they described this is what happened to it. And what I uncovered when I dug deeper and deeper into the situation is that this person actually went above and beyond and saved the company over $500 by doing something that wasn't necessarily part of their job description with a budget they weren't necessarily held accountable to. And instead of just looking at it and saying, oh, there's not a problem here, I want to move on, I was actually hunting for things that this person was doing great. And what I found was an extraordinary effort. And then what I was able to do is describe to them how I think they're irreplaceable in the company because of this extraordinary effort that they put into this thing beyond the level that I expect any employee to do it from. And what actually happened in that situation is just the same thing. I was just taking the situation and I was seeing the good in the person and I was communicating that to them. And this is a case where they were living up to their best self and they were actually exceeding expectations. And I made sure that they knew about that. And the old me would have said, if there's not a problem, I'm not going to spend my time on this. I was just looking for efficient ways to spend my time to solve problems. What I've learned over time is that one of the best things I can do is not catch people who are doing things wrong, but catch them when they're doing something right, catch them when they're going above and beyond, and communicate that as openly and as publicly as I can in order to set that precedent of what great work looks like in this company. So I don't know if this podcast is helpful to anybody. I don't know if anybody has experienced the same things that I did. If I were to summarize what was necessary for me, it's that I felt like most of the advice people were giving me was attacking the things I was doing. And what was really wrong was my mindset going to work every day. And it was my weaknesses, basically, in managing my own emotions and managing my own perception of my life, this company, of the other people that I worked with. And all of that was what was in my heart. And it was just oozing out. And everybody was attacking those symptoms of that. It was, and the only thing I could have done, in my opinion, to get better at this was just to go to the root of that and to fix me. And that's the advice I have for anybody that's in a similar position. I hope this was valuable. I know this is a little bit different, but I hope you saw value in this. If you did, please subscribe to the podcast. Please leave a review. We love seeing good reviews if you feel like this is impactful content. And I will see you next week.